Okay. Um, so this next video is going to be about cognitive choice and self-regulation theories. The past perspective that was needs-based really seems to indicate that human beings don't have as much choice in what motivates us and how we are motivated. Cognitive choice perspectives and self-regulation theories acknowledge that we do consciously decide what we're going to do, and we are aware of our motives because needs-based theories, they do stem originally from these early psychological theories that basically argued, we were almost puppets being moved about by our needs and not that we had any say in what we did or how we did it. So this perspective is a little bit different from that and acknowledges the conscious processes that lead us to behave in one way or another. So learning-based motives, this does not appear in your textbook. Does not appear in your textbook, but I still think it's really important. You've probably heard it in your intro psychology class though, so it's hopefully nothing new to most of you. So learning-based motives stem from some behavioral psychology, the classic behavioral psychology research. We're all familiar with the classical conditioning understanding of why organisms behave a certain way. The idea is if you pair an outcome with a stimulus, people will, or organisms will expect that outcome with the stimulus if and react accordingly, even when the outcome isn't presented. So, for example, Pavlov's dog showed this. Pavlov rang a bell, showed a piece of meat to the dog salivated. He did this so many times that when he started to ring the bell without the piece of meat, the dog still salivated. One thing that people forget to mention about that is that eventually when Pavlov kept ringing the bell and didn't present the meat, the dog would stop salivating. So classical conditioning only works so long as the stimulus has been paired with the outcome enough times that you have associated it. If you stop pairing them together, then the desired response will fade away. So Pavlov's dog, we probably don't operate this way as much. I'll show you a humorous example of this though in a second, but we do see it sometimes in our reactions to certain stimuli. So I, for one, know that when I hear my alarm ringtone as someone else's timer ringtone or their cell phone, like their just call ringtone, it makes me like anxious and jumpy because that's how I feel when I wake up in the morning and I hear my alarm. So something like that would be an example of how we actually do experience classical conditioning in our own lives. But I'm going to pause this recording and I'm going to show you another demonstration, albeit unrealistic, of classical conditioning. I hope this works. So let's see. So while I don't actually recommend doing this with your fellow employees, that's another way that we can visualize classical conditioning. Now, modern approaches at learning is more of a process that we can be cognitively aware of. So in this approach, we have an experience, and based on that experience, we make a choice about our subsequent behaviors. Now we are aware of the consequences of those behaviors based on our experiences, and then we evaluate the actual consequences. So for example, you may say, well, I'm generally sure that if I come in late, I'm going to be punished. So maybe I choose to come in on time every day. And one day I decide to test the waters. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to risk it. Come in late, and evaluate, do I get punished? If I don't get punished, I may reevaluate my understanding of what happens in response to me coming late. And if I, start to actually experience punishment, then maybe I'll stop. So in that way, we are more cognitively aware of these, what would be called potentially behavioral contingencies. So if I do this thing, then something will happen. And we make a conscious choice based on our knowledge of the outcomes about what we will do. Another way that we can learn that isn't necessarily what Pavlov and his colleagues expected is through social learning. So this is where we observe others and we can observe what happens to them, either directly or through what they tell us, the stories that they tell. This, of course, only works for things that you can actually, see and outcomes that you can see. But for example, you may observe your coworker coming in late and you may see that she gets punished for coming in late on a regular basis. And based on that, you conclude, I'm not going to come in late. So you don't even have to have the direct experience with the outcome. You can observe what happens to other people, right? You could observe someone else touching a stove and realizing, ouch, it's hot. You don't now need to go and touch the stove to make sure that it is hot. You have learned, if I touch the stove, I will get burned. So that's just another way that we can learn and be motivated by what we've observed others experiencing. So this is another thing that you may be familiar with from intro psych. This is reinforcement. Reinforcement basically looks at this idea that our behaviors are reinforced by their consequences. So what happens, in response to you coming late, in response to you touching the stove in the work kitchen, is going to change whether you do that again. So there are different types of reinforcement. There are two basically factors that we consider when we're looking at the type of reinforcement or the consequences: positive and negative, and reinforcement versus punishment. Positive and negative refers to whether something is being given or taken away, respectively. So it is positive when something is being given, and it is negative when something is being taken away. So it's not the nature of what is being taken away. It is just, am I giving you something? That's positive. Am I taking something away from you? That's negative. Reinforcement refers to when you, by virtue of giving or taking, so both, it doesn't matter what you're doing, but by virtue of what you do, you are reinforcing the behavior. You're encouraging it to happen again. Punishment, on the other hand, is when whatever you are doing, giving or taking away, is supposed to stop the behavior. So reinforcement, regardless of what you're doing, is with the goal of continuing the behavior, encouraging it to happen again. Punishment, regardless of what you are doing, is with the goal of getting the behavior to stop. So positive reinforcement is the one that makes the most sense to people. So when we hear a lot about positive reinforcement is when you give people something desirable for the purpose of encouraging the thing to happen in the future. An example of this would be a reward, a bonus for good performance. So if you want your employees to continue to have year after year good performance, good sales, good acquisitions, you may continue to give them bonus after bonus in response to their good performance because you want that to continue. So you're giving them something desirable for the purpose of reinforcing, encouraging the behavior to continue. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is when you want a behavior to continue, but you take away something that is undesirable. So let's say that in your workplace, employees have to come in one weekend a month to work. And you say, well, I'm actually going to take that requirement away from people who have the best quarterly sales. So the next quarter, they won't have to come in, or the next month after they post good sales, they won't have to come in on the weekend. So you take away something people don't want to do, presumably working on the weekend, in order to encourage a behavior to happen. In this case, once again, good sales. So that's negative reinforcement. You take something undesirable away to reinforce the behavior that you want them to engage in. A parent might do this by, say, taking away their child's required chores when they get good grades. This might not fly with what I talked about earlier with extrinsic motivation, but for the purposes of this discussion, let's say that that's a good example. So a parent may say, you don't have to do your chores anymore if you get an A, if you get all A's this semester. That would be an example of negative reinforcement. Negative punishment is when you take something desirable away in order to stop a behavior. So let's say that employees get a catered lunch every month, and you say, okay, if you all don't meet this particular sales quota, that lunch gets taken away. And let's say everybody loves the lunch. It's from their favorite restaurant. They like that it's free. They like that it gives them an excuse to have a long lunch that they can count towards their worked hours. So if you take it away, you're taking away something they like in order to punish them when they don't do something they should. Or, the flip side of it is when they do something they shouldn't. But in this case, let's say, for example, your employees don't meet your sales quota. for a particular month. You say, okay, next month catered lunch is off because you guys didn't do what you were supposed to. So I am punishing you. The idea here being that you want them to stop failing to meet their sales goals for a given month or a quarter. Another example of this could be you say to specific employees, you can't come to the catered lunch if you come in late at all this month. So you want them to not come in late. So you will punish them when they do come in late by taking away something they like. So if someone comes in late, they don't get to go to the catered lunch anymore. You've taken away something that they like in order to stop them coming in late in the future. Positive punishment, on the other hand, is when you give employees something in order to stop a behavior, so something undesirable. So in this case, you may give kitchen cleaning duty to people who show up late to work. So people presumably don't like kitchen cleaning duty. I hated doing it when I worked in organizations. And so you may say, okay, Megan, if you come in on time, if you come in late, then you will have to do kitchen cleaning duty. Do what you're supposed to, you'll be good. And of course, there are corollaries to this, right? Punishment and reinforcement, and it's all about framing, right? But let's say I say, I am going to give someone something undesirable to stop their undesirable behaviors. That would be positive punishment. So you will say, employee, if you come in late, you will have to clean the kitchen. In that way, that would be positive punishment because you are giving them something undesirable in order to prevent them from doing a particular behavior. So the goal of reinforcement in a nutshell is to encourage a behavior. The goal of punishment is to discourage or stop a behavior. Positive refers to giving something, negative refers to taking it away. We'll revisit this, I think, when we talk about OB modification a little bit later. Equity theory is a little shift from these more traditional learning-based perspectives on how we are motivated. Equity theory basically argues that you compare your inputs and outputs with other people. And we generally all prefer equity. We want things to stay the same. So inequity occurs when you perceive that your inputs and outputs are not proportional to that of another person. So you find out, for example, that you work the same hours as another person, you came in at the same time, but they're making more money than you. That would be inequity. The flip side would also be inequity if you find out that they're making less money than you. We'll talk about what people do in those different situations. When inequity happens, and for the record, I won't show this for the sake of time, but there are, I think if you look up Franz de Waal, Franz, I don't know, I think that's how he spells his first name, Dewaal. He has done some research on this in primates. Primates have the same reactions to inequity. They do not like it. And it's been happening with so primates and other animals as well. But the point here is that when inequity happens, people make different choices motivated by that inequity. So one thing that they do is they change their input. So you may say, let's take the example of you find out that your coworker is being paid more than you are. And maybe you conclude that that's because they are, even though they came in at the same time and they work as many hours as you do, they work a lot harder. So you decide, okay, I'm going to put forth more effort at work so I get paid more. So you change your input. You change whatever it is that you're being compensated on. Another another thing that you could do is you could change your outcome. So you could say, hey, I want a raise. I deserve to be paid as much as he or she does. So that in that way you change your outcomes, and in that way you achieve equity. Because the idea, once again, is you're trying to achieve equity here. You could alter your perceptions of yourself. So you could say, sort of alluding to what I'd said earlier, you could say, you know what, this actually isn't inequitable because I don't work as much. I don't work very hard. This is also related to altering your perceptions of the other. You could say, hey, that person works very harder than I do. So you can change your understanding of either yourself or the other person that you are comparing them to. Another way that you could change your perception of the other that doesn't really relate to you is you could say, well, this person did come in with more experience. So while we started at the same time and we have the same job, they came in with more experience. I, for one, have experienced that myself. Came in as an assistant professor at the same time someone else came in as an assistant professor. They made more money than I did because they had had 5 years more experience than I did. So in that way, I didn't perceive it as being inequitable because I saw that that person had more experience. And in that way, they were therefore deserving of more money. Another way you can do this is you can change your comparison. So I may say, hey, it's not even fair for me to compare myself to that person who came in at the same time as me because of their experience. So then I try to find someone who did come in at the same time I did, who does have a similar job and the same level of experience. And then I can maybe find if what is going on is equitable. And then another option is just to leave the situation. Another option is to just say, you know what, I'm donezo. I don't want to be here. And people quit. So this is why paying your employees an equitable amount, which is something we talked about a little bit earlier with performance assessment, is really important. This is why those assessments of pay equity are so critical, is because your employees may just leave. I should say another option on changing inputs, if you feel like you are being underpaid, is, yes, some people may say, oh, I'm going to work harder so I can get to that level and therefore get the outcome the other person has. Or the person may say, you know what, I'm not going to work as hard anymore. If I'm being relatively underpaid and I believe that we are working the same, I am going to actually start to work a lot less. So that's another reason why we would want to make sure that things are equitable in our organization. So some of the predictions that we would get therefore from equity theory is that when people are underpaid, they will produce lesser poor quality output for hourly workers. For piece rate workers, so workers who just are paid based on the pieces that they make, they will produce a lot of bad pieces of work. For overpayment, we would predict that hourly workers will produce higher, more quality output, and that piece rate workers will produce fewer units of higher quality work. So what do we actually find though in practice, or rather in research? Go back. What we do find is that the research regarding, or rather the expectations regarding underpayment, are pretty well supported. People do react negatively to being underpaid, relatively underpaid. Overpayment, though, we actually find that people are pretty tolerant of being overpaid. No shock there that people are pretty okay with getting paid more relative to other people. So like I said, it's mixed. The findings are mixed about whether we actually find that these predictions based in equity theory are borne out. The book notes, and I won't go into it too much, but the book does note that this might be based on the fact that there are individual differences related to equity. So you have people who are, so there's something called equity sensitivity. You have 3 types of people. It's of course a continuum, but you have 3 types of people. Equity sensitives, these are people who want everything to be equitable, so you get a proportionate outcome for what you put into something. We have entitleds, these are people who prefer to get overpaid. This is the situation, they want to get more than what they deserve. And then you have benevolence, these are people, and they do exist, who prefer to actually get underpaid. They prefer to be relatively undercompensated in terms of equity theory. And so we do find that their reactions to these different situations are based on these individual differences. So some people are really tolerant of inequity. And so that might be why some of these things don't pan out. Because of entitles being in our samples, we may find once again that people are really tolerant of overpayment, as we found in research. Related to equity theory is something known as organizational justice. Now, organizational justice we can talk about in a number of different places. This is actually what I study, is organizational fairness. And organizational justice is, we basically argue and have found consistently that people care about being treated fairly, and that if you treat your employees unfairly, they don't perform well. The reason why this gets paired with a discussion of equity theory is that equity theory was one of the almost progenitors of our studies of organizational fairness. that people do care about their outcomes being proportional to their inputs. From this, we get something known as distributive fairness. And when we're looking at organizations, we're usually looking at things like your salary, your rewards, your recognition. Are these things proportional to your performance? And we ask people about that. And in that way, we get at their distributive perceptions of fairness. We also care, people also care about whether procedures are fairly applied to them, whether they are treated with respect and dignity, and whether information is provided. So for example, as I said, this is what I study. So in my class, this is why I am always explaining to you why I do the things that I do, because while you may think, oh, these aren't distributively or procedurally fair, that's why I'm always giving information to explain, here's actually what's going on with the procedures. Here's why you're getting the outcomes that you're getting. So in that way, I try to practice as much as I can what I preach. What's critical, though, to note here is that as researchers like myself acknowledge with regard to organizational justice, it's all about perception. So one person could perceive something as being totally unfair when in reality, we would consider it objectively fair. Or someone may perceive something to be fair that other people wouldn't. So it's all about perception. And this is why when you are running your own organization, you may say, it doesn't matter what I do, they all think that this is unfair. Even though I'm trying to be distributively fair, I'm trying to be procedurally fair, I'm trying to give information, people will still say that things are unfair around here. That's just because fairness is perception, and sometimes there's only so much that we can do. There's also overall fairness. So sometimes we are just considered or concerned rather with just how in general we are treated. And indeed what research shows is while these are important to understand is the different criteria that people may judge fairness in an organization by, we do generally find that people's overall perceptions of fairness are really what impact their choices and behaviors and what they do. We also find, though, that it's not just about our perception of fairness as a victim. We also find that people care in organizations about how others are treated. So even if you're not treated fairly, you will react negatively when other people are treated unfairly. We also find that people, we're starting to study the enactment of justice. So when people decide to be fair and unfair, this is something that I've studied in makeup calls in organizations and sports. We also find that people as a form of third-party justice are concerned with their organization's social responsibility. So how fair is the organization to society at large? And we also find that people react to the justice they experience in teams because we know that how we are treated as an individual can sometimes diverge from how the group is treated. And that's where we get something like justice climate. So what happens when you treat people fairly? Why does this, or how does this motivate people, right? We can all understand that I don't like being treated unfairly, but what am I going to do? Or what are my employees going to do if I say don't pay them an appropriate amount? Or rather, what will happen when I do? You know, people need to be treated fairly, and I believe that, and you may say I believe that too, so what should I do? And what will happen when I do this? Well, you know, like I said, you can treat people fairly in terms of their pay, apply procedures equally to them, provide information when they ask for it. So if they're saying, I don't know why I'm not getting paid an appropriate amount, always explain it to them to the extent that you can, and then just treat them with respect and dignity. Now, what happens when you treat people fairly? Well, better performance, more job satisfaction. They're more committed to the organization. They engage in more OCBs, fewer CWBs. And so there's so many things that fairness impacts. You know, I researched this, so I think treating people fairly is really important in organizations and often gets overlooked. But as your professor, you cannot, I can tell you, you cannot overlook treating people fairly because it really motivates them to do some things that you will not want them to do when they are treated unfairly. I did a study once where we treated people unfairly and they stole stuff. And that was the whole point, was we were looking at whether they were going to steal things. So just a little insight as to like what can actually happen and what researchers, including myself, have documented. Another theory that is a little shift from the fairness, so we're not talking about fairness anymore, done the fairness side of things, is expectancy theory. Expectancy theory has also been just called VIE. It basically argues that we appraise a situation based on how well we think we will perform and what will happen in that situation if we perform well. So there are three criteria that we judge it by: expectancy, instrumentality, and valence. Expectancy is about our effort to performance expectancy. So do we think that the effort we put forth will lead to performance? So let's talk about this course. So you may say, I don't think that if I put forth any effort, it's actually going to lead to me getting an A in this course. So in that way, you're just not going to try. And that happens. If you feel like a course is too hard and there's no point in trying, then you're not going to. But if you feel like effort will lead to an substantial increase in performance, then you will put forth the effort. We also have to consider instrumentality. So will performance lead to outcomes that we want? So will getting an A in this class lead to something that another valued outcome, like getting on the dean's list or graduating with honors? So will your performance, whatever it may be, lead to some other outcome that you actually, some other outcome? And then you have to ask yourself the valence of that outcome or the subsequent outcome. So, or rather the valence of the performance or the valence of the outcome itself. So do you value the outcome? So do you find getting an A just to be in and of itself valuable? Gets at some of the intrinsic motivation stuff we talked about earlier. Or do you find value in the outcome of getting on the dean's list, graduating with honors, etc.? If you don't find either of those things to be valuable, then you will not perform. And so in short, behavior is contingent on high effort to performance expectancy, high prevalence or high performance to outcome expectancy, and valence of outcomes. You need all three of these. Presumably, you need to believe that your effort will lead to performance. So you need to believe that trying will get you that A. You need to believe that getting that A will get you something that you will get you something else. So getting on the dean's list, getting graduating with honors, and you need to value either getting an A, either the outcome or the outcome of that outcome. So you need to believe that getting the A is valuable, or that getting on the dean's list is valuable, or graduating with honors is valuable. Okay, so let's talk about self-regulation theories. Self-regulation theories of motivation are somewhat similar to the control and decision approach, to the more cognitive approach effectively to motivation. But here it really focuses on a couple of key things. The biggest one is goal setting. Basically, how do we regulate ourselves in the pursuit of some sort of behavior, some sort of goal, some sort of end, and how does that motivate us to persist, to pursue it? So goal setting theory, like I said, is the primary thing that most people think of when they think of these self-regulatory approaches. Goal setting theory is based on the idea that our behaviors are the results of goals and intentions, our goals. And goals are usually some sort of rather internalized ideal state. In other words, it's a thing that you're trying to achieve, something that is different from what you are now, what you're doing now, what you're achieving now. And by virtue of introducing that discrepancy between what you're doing now and what you want to be doing, it creates this goal, it creates this dissonance, and you want to reduce that dissonance by virtue of trying to pursue that goal. So that's what a goal is and how it affects your behaviors. So goals have different features, including difficulty, specificity, acceptance, and commitment. Research tends to show that goals need to be and we'll revisit this in a second, but goals vary in terms of their difficulty. So how hard are they? How achievable are they? They also vary in their specificity, and I think we will revisit this. Here we go. Yeah, we'll revisit that in a second. So how specific is the goal? Is it a do your best goal, which is effectively that, just go do your best, or is it something specific like sell 10 reams of paper by the end of the day? Goals also vary in your acceptance of the goal. So how much have you accepted the goal as important to yourself? And therefore related to that, how committed are you to pursuing the goal? Now, why do goals work? Well, I just talked about how goals create this discrepancy between your current state and an idealized or future state. And by virtue of introducing that discrepancy, it encourages you to pursue that goal. Goals also work because we just, in general, we feel pride when we achieve them and shame when we don't. And so people want to pursue those emotional states as well. They also want to pursue the emotional states that will lead them to experience the pride when they achieve a goal and avoid shame when they have failed to do so. So, what makes a goal work well? Because not all goals are created equal. And you may buy into goal setting theory. You may, as a future or current manager, say, I think goals work. I think that giving people goals motivates them to perform better. So, but you might know that sometimes setting goals with people just doesn't change their behavior. So, what can I do? Well, one way is commitment. You need to get people committed to the goals. If someone isn't committed, if they don't basically have a personal investment in achieving the goal, they're just not going to strive for it. And that makes sense, right? If you've ever been given a goal that you have no commitment toward, like getting an A in a class that you don't really feel a personal investment in, you're not going to strive to achieve that goal. Another thing, though, that makes goals really effective is feedback. I can't stress this enough. Feedback is critical for so many organizational functions to work. We talked about this in terms of training and development, and it comes up here as well, that feedback is important for us to understand how we are achieving our goals. And I'll focus on goals here, though feedback is critical for a lot of motivational theories. I'll focus on it here. Feedback is critical for understanding, am I actually achieving my goal? What else do I need to do to get to it? How close am I to achieving it? How much more do I have to do? What behaviors must I alter? What is working? What isn't? And so without that feedback, we don't know if we're achieving our goals. And also without feedback, it's really easy to give up because some people, when they don't know how they're doing, they just choose to stop. They choose to stop pursuing their goal. And so you don't want that. Generally, we find that goals work well with tasks that are relatively low on complexity. So what I mean is your goals have to usually be geared towards something that's relatively easy to do. The more complex a task, the more we have to rely on things like ability and individual differences to get us to the finish line, particularly cognitive ability, namely intelligence. The more intelligent a person is, the more likely that comes into play as a goal or as a task becomes more complex compared to when something is low in complexity. So something like running a marathon isn't super complex, and this is dealing more with physical ability, but running a marathon actually isn't all that complex. And I say that as, you know, admittedly, as someone who has run multiple marathons, it's not that hard to do in the sense of what you're being asked to do, like task wise. It's not that hard to put one foot in front of the other to understand how to run, right? So in that way, goal setting could actually be really good to help you run a marathon. It's not that it's not challenging, it's just it's not a complex test. And those are two different things. Complexity is related to something being challenging, but they aren't one and the same. Doing something, though, like a Tough Mudder, a triathlon, or even a decathlon, that's complex because you're doing a lot of different tasks and you're required to use a lot of different physical skill sets. The same applies for cognitive tasks as well, for the record, that the more cognitively complex a task becomes, the more we have to rely on someone's ability to get it done, as opposed to their goal setting and motivation when something is relatively low in complexity. So for example, doing a 1,000 piece puzzle, putting a puzzle together actually isn't all that complex, like a basic jigsaw puzzle. But so in that way, goal setting may actually lead to more success on a task like that. But if we were to do something like building a 3D model using CAD software and a 3D printer of this thing that appears in the jigsaw puzzle, well, that is a little bit more complex and would rely on your ability as well as resources, which goes back to that three-legged stool we talked about earlier. The next thing I have here are specific goals, and it's in caps because this is a really important point. Specific goals consistently outperform do your best goals. So what do I mean by that? Consistent goals are always better than general do your best or just try harder. Those kinds of goals are useless. You might as well say nothing. A specific goal, on the other hand, is much easier to do. So if you come to me and if ever I say, just do your best in this class, you have every right to say, hey, Dr. Thornton-Lugo, that's not what you told us in class works well. In fact, if you were thinking about, well, in this class, I could tell you, just do your best and it'll all work out. But a more helpful goal for a teacher to give you is, here are the grades that you need to get in order to achieve this level of performance in this class, or here are the specific assignments that you need to do well on, and here's the grade level that you've done well. And I've done this for students in this class. I've done this for students where I've spelled out, here's what you need to do on the quizzes on average, here's what you need to do on the assignments on average, here's how much of the extra credit you need to do. Those are specific goals. And in that way, that really helps people a lot better. It helps you understand, what do you need to do? And in terms of that feedback I mentioned in a couple of points above here, it helps you understand when you are performing well and when you are not. So specific goals are not only good for motivating you and understanding what you need to do in order to achieve that level of performance, but it really helps you gauge how well you are performing. We also want goals that are of moderate difficulty, and this resonates with some of the points that were brought up from need for achievement. Namely, a goal that is too difficult for anyone to achieve may not work really well for them. And that might be where we get to someone saying, telling someone to run a marathon is a really bad goal to set, because it is very difficult to run a marathon. It's not complex, but it is difficult. So in that way, you may be better off saying, start by running a 5K, because that's a moderate level of difficulty for your average physically in shape person. But it's because, and we focus on moderate difficulty because we don't want something so easy that when we achieve it, we don't actually feel that level of pride that we would. And that would, sustain our goals, right? If you don't expect to feel pride, and this is also somewhat similar to what we talked about with expectancy theory, if you don't expect to feel pride from achieving your goals, then you probably won't persist in them. So this is why we also need goals that are of moderate difficulty, because we anticipate that achieving them will actually give us some sort of satisfaction. But we also don't want them so hard that we just can't do them. So from this, we get this acronym known as SMART goals. You may have heard of this before. And this is one of those things that actually appears in organizational practices that is valid and isn't actually a crock of what. But SMART goals, there are a number of different ways that you can use, make this acronym work. I've given a couple of alternative ways to do it. But usually the S in SMART is specific. The next one is usually measurable. I've also seen it as meaningful, but measurable is critical, once again, because of that feedback part. So specific, we've already talked about, but measurable is really critical. You need a goal that you can understand how you are performing in, and that's somewhat related to the specific side of things. So you need something that you can measure your progress in, so you understand how much more you need to do and when you're succeeding and when you're failing. It also needs to be attainable. So this gets back to that moderate difficulty. Is it realistic for you to do? It's not realistic for me to go on the moon. It just isn't. So related to that, some people also say actionable. Is it something you can actually try to pursue? Another is relevant or realistic. Realistic is somewhat related to the point above. Like I said, people change these things. So just generally, these are some of the principles that come up here. Relevant is also, once again, is it something that's important to you? Is it something that matters to you? Is it something that you actually care about? And then time specific. So this is one thing that did not get brought up in the previous slides, but you need a goal that has a time frame. So if you, and this is because without a time frame, it's actually really hard to know, are you making progress toward what you want to do? So you could say, I want to run a marathon, and that's all well and good, but unless you have a time frame, then it's really hard to judge, well, how well are you pursuing that? And if you say, I want to run a marathon by the end of the year, then that gives you a time frame. That gives you a way to assess, am I achieving this thing that I set out to achieve? So there are some times that goal setting can be bad, because usually people talk about how wonderful goal setting is, and it is. It's one of the most well-validated ways to motivate people, but it can be with its own drawbacks. One is when you have a narrow focus on one outcome. So in organizations, if you give your employee a goal and it forces them to get or leads to them to get tunnel vision, so they're not paying attention to anything else other than this goal you've set for them. That can be a problem because we often want our employees to possess and pursue multiple goals at once. Another time that it can be bad is when employees are so focused on achieving that goal that in the process of getting feedback and learning how to do better, they don't actually learn, right? They're not actually paying attention to what lessons am I learning and how can I do this better the next time. So back to the marathon example, you may say, you may be so focused on just getting to the finish line, both metaphorically and literally, that you don't focus on, okay, what exercises worked well for me? What diet worked well for me? What types of uh, running exercises were good for me? What was not working? What playlist was good? What wasn't? So those kinds of things are actually helpful. So you have to be self-aware as you're going through this process. If you get that tunnel vision, that's when goal setting can be really bad. So related to goal setting is self-regulation. Now, self-regulation is somewhat of a corollary or related process to goal setting because particularly Jeff, I think his first name is Jeff Vancouver has noted that, obviously part of pursuing goals is this self-regulatory process, this process by which we regulate ourselves and we regulate what we do so we do pursue our goals and so we do achieve them. So it's the maintenance of internally represented desired state within the self. In other words, it's the maintenance of your goals. Internally represented desired states within the self could just be translated to goals. So it is a process that involves goal establishment, and we'll talk about these: goal establishment, planning, striving, and revision. So goal establishment is just that. You're establishing your goals, you develop your dimensions. Of course, goals can be both ones that you develop yourself or those that come from your organization or a mix of both. Both can be basically when someone persuades you to take on a goal. So you're not just doing it because someone's telling you you have to, you've actually been persuaded that it's a worthwhile goal. Then there's planning. So planning is translating your goals into action. So developing what are known as behavioral paths. Because if you don't develop behavioral paths for your goal, you probably won't achieve them. So what does that mean? What it means is that you basically establish heuristics. If A, then B. So if this happens, then I will do B, this thing that helps me pursue the goal. So for example, in an organization, if you say, I want to sell 10 reams of paper by the end of the week, you may say, okay, in order to do that, I now have to call a new client every day, or I have to call 5 old clients every day and assess their paper needs. And so in that way, when you set up a plan, you aren't sort of easily distracted by other things that may come up. Like we mentioned, organizations want us to do multiple things at one time, and that's important to balance everything. But when you say, this is what I want to do every day, then you can have to-do lists and checklists by which you assess your performance, which we'll get to in a second. But the way that you can assess your performance and whether you're achieving what you thought you would do is by planning, by saying, every morning when I get in, I'm going to do this. Or every time a client calls me, I'm going to say, hey, do you need any more paper? And you sell it. So in that way, you've actually developed these behavioral pathways so your goal can actually manifest into behaviors. And this is something that seems intuitive. That if you have a goal, you should make some specific plans, but some people don't take that next step. They set a goal, but they don't actually say, okay, now what am I specifically going to do to get there? So then, as I said, the next part is goal striving and monitoring. So you're actually doing the things that you said you would do to achieve the goal, and you're keeping track of it. Like I said, be it through to-do lists. I personally use bullet journals, which are glorified to-do lists, but I love it. And bullet journaling has honestly really changed the way that I monitor my own goal pursuit. And if it's something I thought it was ridiculous when I first saw it and just something people put on Pinterest and Instagram that looks pretty, but it's actually really helpful. And it's because you need to monitor your progress in pursuing a goal. Now, the final stage in self-regulation is revision. And I believe, let me just make sure, let me see if we get there in a second. Yeah, we'll get to this in a little bit more. But revision is where we decide what we're going to do. So we look at our progress and we say, am I achieving what I want to, or am I not? And if I am, I may persist, which is the last thing I see here. So I'll just keep doing it, because if I'm saying, hey, I'm getting there, I'm getting to those 10 reams of paper, just keep doing what I'm doing, I'm going to get there. Another thing that you may say if you realize that it's not going your way is you may say, okay, I'm done. It's not going to work. In this economy, who can sell 10 reams of paper? No one uses paper anymore, and no one's working face to face. It's all online anyway. So I'm done. I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to give up. I'm done. I'm not going to revisit this goal again. You could revise it. You could say, okay, 10 reams was unrealistic in this economy, or given just everything that's going on, let's just do five reams of paper. So you just change some specific aspect of your goal to maybe make it a little bit more achievable. Another is, and for the record, you could also revise your goal to make it harder. That could happen. You say, oh, I already sold 10 reams. I'm going to actually make it up to 20. So that's also possible. Tabling is another option, an alternate to quitting, actually, where you say, okay, I'm not going to do it this week. This week is really hard. A bunch of my clients are under quarantine, so they're not working anyway. Let's wait a couple of weeks. Let's wait till cases go down, maybe some more businesses open up, and then I will pursue it again. So those are some of the ways you can revise your goal setting. And like I said, this is, or I didn't say, but this is very clearly a sort of cyclical process. So, you can go back once you've revised to this goal striving and monitoring phase. So another approach to self-regulation is from Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura is one of the most prolific psychologists in the history of psychology. Albert Bandura argued that self-regulation happens through self-observation, self-evaluation, and self-reaction. So self-observation refers to we just pay attention to our actions. We engage in self-evaluation. We pay attention to our behavior, and we therefore provide feedback to ourselves by virtue of paying attention to our behavior. So we compare our behavior to some sort of evaluative standard, and then we basically give ourselves feedback. And then we decide, how do I feel about this? Do I feel okay? And what am I going to do about it? So for example, you may say, I'm not achieving what I wanted to. So I'm not selling those 10 reams of paper, or I'm not actually running as much as I should to race in a marathon. What does this make me feel, and what am I going to do about it? If you're okay with it, you may say, hey, I'm in the middle of a pandemic. I'm just lucky to get outside and get exercise. I'm okay with not actually achieving my goal. That's a totally normal reaction to have. Or you may say, no, I'm going to fix this. Or you may say, I'm going to quit. So it's very similar to a lot of what we talked about here in Vancouver's process of self-regulation. So self-efficacy is this individual difference that sort of emerged from Bandura's research. And self-efficacy is also something that's been pretty well researched. And I think I maybe talked about it in our predictors lecture. So if I did, I apologize. But this is actually one of those things that you maybe would want to measure your employees on, because in addition to conscientiousness, it's actually a really strong predictor of job performance. But what is self-efficacy? Self-efficacy is basically the belief that you are capable of doing things. In a nutshell, people who are high in self-efficacy, and I think I'll talk about it in a second, a little bit about what it affects, but people who are high in self-efficacy believe in general that they are capable of doing things. Now, of course, this isn't, an unrealistic sense of oneself. So I, for one, am generally pretty high on self-efficacy, but even I acknowledge, like I said, I can't go to the moon. I can't build a 3D model of an action figure using CAD software. But generally, I feel that the things that are within my reach are possible for me to do. And I have a pretty broad idea of what I think I can do. Or that if I tried hard enough, I could learn how to model something using CAD software. Or I could go to the moon if I completely changed my career path, but I'm far too old at this point to make that happen, unless something really changes in NASA or Elon Musk makes some changes as to who he wants to be part of his missions. But that all being said, I believe that if I tried hard enough and had the time, I could do a triathlon. And I believe that if I wanted to, I could teach myself how to play guitar, right? There are a lot of people, though, who don't possess a high level of self-efficacy. They just think, I can't do it. I can't do things. I can't do it. No, there's no amount of time. Or it's just like, yeah, they just don't think that they can. So what's great about self-efficacy and why we would want to measure our employees on it, or rather job candidates on it, is because it has a positive impact on goal-directed behaviors. So it has a positive impact on people's behaviors that they engage in when they are pursuing goals. as well as performance. So in general, people who are high in self-efficacy tend to perform well because, and we'll talk about that in a second, because when you believe that you can do something, you act in a way that's consistent with that. A general principle of psychology, and I think we will not revisit this. Sorry, going through the rest of the lectures in my head. A general principle of psychology that may have been introduced in your introductory psychology class is that people behave in ways that are generally consistent with how they view themselves. If someone believes themselves to be capable of doing things generally, they are going to keep acting like someone who believes they can do something. Someone who believes that they can do something is going to keep trying. Someone who thinks they can't, they give up like that. You don't want an employee who's a quitter. And I know that that sounds really derisive, but that's effectively what low self-efficacy is. It's someone who believes that they can't do things and therefore they quit. But here's the great thing about self-efficacy. Though it is an individual difference, you can develop it. It's not something that's set in stone. So self-efficacy can be something that we as managers and employers can develop. So one really easy way to cultivate self-efficacy, and this relates to some of the stuff that I talked about with goal setting as well as need for achievement, is mastery experiences. So mastery experiences are those moderately difficult tasks and accomplishments that people can do to build their confidence, right? So if you are a manager and you have someone who you believe or you actually measure them and they are low on self-efficacy, what you can do is you can give them moderately or mildly difficult goals to achieve. And by doing so, you once again go through that process of you give them something that is presumably not so difficult that they can't achieve it, but difficult enough that when they do, they feel a sense of accomplishment. They develop that confidence. They say, I did something that was hard. I think I can now do anything. I mean, outside of the workplace, that's how I certainly felt when I ran my first marathon, that now I can do this anytime. And though I only had an intention of running one, I have run multiple since then. The same happens in work, right? You have your employee who says, I can't ever make a sale to a customer. I've never made a sale and I'm never going to make a sale. You say, let's just make one by the end of the quarter. Let's just make one and you can do, and then we will go from there. That's the mastery experience that you can help them, or that can help them develop their confidence and therefore their self-efficacy and related their confidence. Another way that we can help develop self-efficacy is through modeling. This goes back to some of our social learning stuff we talked about earlier in this module or in one of the other videos. Modeling is where we show other people, similar people, I can do it and so can you. So we may say this to this employee who says, I can't make a sale to a customer. I never have and I never will. We may say, hey, why don't you follow Joe over here? Joe was just like you a couple of years ago, and now look how he does it. And so by virtue of showing them someone, presumably someone who's similar enough that they won't dismiss them and say that person isn't like me and I can't compare, they may say, okay, this is someone who is like me. Maybe I can do what they do. And by doing that, once again, through this process of basically social learning, you say, if they're able to do it, then maybe I can too. Another way is through social persuasion. This is where other people convince someone that they are able to do things. So if you are a manager and you have an employee who seems to be low on self-efficacy, you may start to try to persuade them, say, I believe in you. I think you can do this thing. I think you are capable. Why would I have hired you if I did not think you were capable? The critical thing about social persuasion, though, is to not lead people into delusions of grandeur, to lead them to a place where they have realistic, or rather your goal is to lead them to a place of realistic expectations for themselves. So if you have someone who has never made a sale, your goal in social persuasion isn't to convince them that now they can make 100 in a week. No, your goal is to convince them, hey, maybe we can make one this week. I think you were capable of making one sale this week. I wouldn't have hired you if I didn't think you were. So the goal about social persuasion is, yes, to create this perception of self-efficacy, but don't lead people down a road of delusion. Finally, physiological states can also influence our self-efficacy. So our emotions can lead us to have higher or lower levels of perceived self-efficacy. So what that means basically is my mood impacts how capable I am how capable I feel I am of doing things. And this makes sense, right? We've all been there. When you are in a negative mood, generally you feel like you can't do anything. You're like, I can't do it. I can't. There's nothing I can do. I'm just not capable of anything. But when you are in a good mood, when you are feeling positive emotions, you feel like you can conquer the world. And that's true. You may think, oh, that's just like common folk knowledge. No, that's what research shows, is that your belief of being able to do things increases based on your emotions and your mood. So self-efficacy, therefore, actually has a lot of impacts on various different things, both in and outside the workplace. So self-efficacy leads to the activities in the environments people choose, namely their careers. So we find that, people who are higher in self-efficacy tend to choose more challenging careers, more challenging activities, and they do therefore tend to have more career success. We also find that self-efficacy, and this is related to job performance, it impacts effort. People who are higher in self-efficacy put forth more effort and for a longer amount of time, much like people who are intrinsically motivated. So people who are high in self-efficacy tend to just produce more effort and therefore more performance. This is also why they have better careers than other people. People who are high in self-efficacy tend to be lower in stress and lower in depression. And of course, this is a little bit cyclical, so I will acknowledge that your experience of stress can lead to lower levels of perceived self-efficacy, which can then lead to depression, because part of depression is a feeling of hopelessness and inability to really do anything. So it is a vicious cycle, right? Because then if you're depressed, usually you lack the energy to do anything, and you're so cognitively overwhelmed by these emotions of hopelessness that you're feeling that it, like I said, it becomes a vicious cycle. Which, for the record, if that's anything that you've ever struggled with, feel free to reach out to me, and I can refer you to people on campus, especially during this time of COVID, who can hopefully help with that vicious cycle of depression. But people who are high in self-efficacy, though, this doesn't tend to happen to them as much. Of course, our mood states obviously influence our perceptions of self-efficacy, but this can be a cycle that takes place. Obviously, people who are high in self-efficacy tend to do better at goal pursuit and tend to be more committed to the goals that they pursue. What's really fascinating about people who are high in self-efficacy, and I think this is so cool that people found this, is that people who are high in self-efficacy tend to have more cognitions of future success. What's that mean? That means that people who are high in self-efficacy tend to imagine themselves succeeding more than people who are low in it. So people who are high in self-efficacy may, for example, envision themselves nailing that sales pitch and getting a bunch of new clients in a given week, whereas someone who is low in self-efficacy just doesn't have that type of, not necessarily imagination, but imaginings. They don't see themselves doing that. And I think that that's fascinating, that even in their thoughts about their future, people who are high in self-efficacy still imagine themselves succeeding, and people who are low in self-efficacy don't engage in that as much. Okay. So related to self-efficacy, another individual difference that can impact our pursuit of goals in particular is our implicit theories of intelligence. So people tend to, once again, this is always a continuum, but researchers still do this thing where they group people into, there's one type of person, there's another type of person, and that doesn't make sense. But for the purposes of this discussion, that's what we're going to focus on. People tend to have generally one of two viewpoints on theories of intelligence, one of two theories of intelligence. Incrementalists tend to believe that you can develop your intelligence, that you can continue to learn and develop and grow and become more intelligent, learn more, that you're always capable of growing and developing more. Some of this does relate to the Dunning-Kruger stuff that we talked about a little bit earlier. Now, I'll go to entities and then I'll come back to learning goal and performance goal orientations. Entitists, on the other hand, believe that what you got is what you got. So when it comes to your intelligence, kid, that's what you're stuck with. You're not going to be any better than you are right now. Of course, you can learn more as you go through school, but if you were always middle of the pack in kindergarten through middle school, through high school, through college, you're always going to be middle of the pack. That's what they believe. Those are entists. So incrementalists, therefore, generally tend to have what's known as a learning goal orientation. So incrementalists, because they always believe that they and others can learn and can be better and can develop more in terms of their intelligence, their goals tend to either involve or indirectly or directly learning. So they're always learning from their goals in their pursuit of their goals. And their goals often involve, like I said, more of a learning orientation to them. So the goal is about becoming better. Whereas entists tend to have a performance goal orientation. So their goals are usually just about achieving a certain level of performance, not necessarily learning anything along the way, not necessarily becoming any better, but just reaching a certain goal for the sake of achieving that particular goal. So we find that performance goal orientation is negatively related to self-efficacy. People who tend to have a performance goal orientation, they just aren't that high in self-efficacy. We do find that learning goal orientation, for example, is related positively to sales performance, and this is mediated, so it's accounted for in part by their self-regulation. So people who are higher in learning goal orientation tend to have better self-regulatory processes. So I talked about that a couple of slides ago. It's these things right here. They tend to be better at this than people who have a performance goal orientation. So the general idea here is, once again, that people who tend to believe that they're capable of learning, capable of becoming better, they tend to set goals that reflect that, that have a learning aspect to it. Because of that, they learn more in the process. People who have a performance goal orientation just tend to be focused on that. Like, I'm going to achieve that. I'm done. I don't care how I get to it. I don't really care about learning along the way. I'm just going to get it done, whatever it takes. So that's the difference between the two. Control theory is, I'm not going to go over it too much. A lot of it's covered in your book, so if you want to read that a little bit more, you can. So control theory is basically just that there's a feedback loop when it comes to motivation and performance. I think some of this is somewhat similar to what we talked about with needs theories. You can basically compare yourself and your current present and performance with a goal or a standard, and then you adapt. So you try to either change your goal or change your performance. A lot of the elements, like I said, here are similar to other theories, so I won't revisit it. It's all in the book, but it's pretty much a lot of what I said earlier about you have an internalized state. If you're achieving it, great. If you're not, then you adapt. You either change the goal, you change your performance, or do something else, or quit. The important point that I do want to take away from control theory, and this does come up in the book, and I think it's really relevant, is that we should not look at, and I think some researchers have this problem, don't get me wrong, is that we see quitting as a bad thing. But quitting is not always bad. And if we may discuss this in our decision-making module. I'm not 100% sure yet, but quitting can sometimes be a good thing, because human beings also have this problem known as escalation of commitment. This is not something you need to know for this module, but it's just something that will come up probably later. Escalation of commitment is our tendency to, once we start investing in something, in the sense of pursuing a goal. So we start investing in the pursuit of the goal. We start training for the marathon. We start trying to contact our clients to make more sales. We start to say to ourselves, well, I can't quit now. I've tried so hard, or I've put so much into it. The same goes, for the record, for a bad relationship. But the important thing about quitting is it's not always bad. Sometimes quitting is the appropriate thing to do. You want your employees to quit pursuing a goal that they just can't achieve. You don't want them to waste their time doing something they are incapable of doing for whatever reason, be it that they themselves are incapable of doing it or the environment doesn't allow them to do it. So for example, your employees may not be able to, say, get 10 new clients in an economic recession, which is what we're in right now, which is what we were in around 2005 to 2008. It may be impossible to get new clients. So you may not want your employees to keep pursuing that goal. And in fact, you may want them to quit and say, you know what? I'm going to change my goals. I'm going to quit this goal of trying to get new clients and instead focus on maintaining my relationships with my current clients, because I want to keep the people that I do have, especially in this economy. And so the important point here is sometimes quitting is good. And we don't want to get into that habit of saying, well, I've put so much into it and I've tried so hard, I can't give up now, when in reality, you shouldn't keep wasting your time. If you want to read a little bit more about this, I believe Danny Kahneman has a chapter in his book. It's excellent, called Thinking Fast and Slow. I think that book is a great book, and he's a genius. He's an absolute genius. And he talks about this, about writing an academic book chapter, or just a regular type academic chapter, and failing to quit when they should have. Quitting isn't always bad. Sometimes it's exactly what we should do. So I'm going to stop here. This will be the end of this video. In the next video, we'll talk about application.